Welcome to the Delaware Public Archives First Saturday program series depicting the Second Delaware during the American Civil War. This final installment of the series is going to cover the Second Delaware's involvement in the Overland Campaign of 1864 up until the present time. The Overland Campaign would begin on May 4th, 1864 and span until June of the same year. The 2nd Delaware would be under the 2nd Corps of the 1st Division, who was now commanded by General Francis Barlow, and the 4th Brigade, who was still commanded by Colonel Brooke, as we've talked about in previous installments. The Army of the Potomac was now under the command of General George Meade, with the Army as a whole under command of General Ulysses S. Grant. So this battle in 1864, following the span of the war, would primarily be between wits of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, trying to outmaneuver each other. The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse would be the 2nd Delaware's climax, if you will, and the battle would begin on May the 12th, 1864. The 2nd Delaware would attack the Muleshoe, as can be seen in this map, and they would be under Barlow. The Muleshoe was an extremely well-planned defensive position by the Confederate forces, having been entrenched for weeks before the Union Army was able to actually attack. And so the 2nd Delaware, along with other regiments, would perform a full frontal assault on the entrenchments. Private J.W. Muffley, regimental adjutant of the 148th Pennsylvania Infantry of the 4th Brigade, 1st Division, 2nd Corps, in which the 2nd Delaware was also a part of, writes, "In the early morning, just as our line reached the works, Captain Lincoln of the 64th New York and another officer, whose face I did not see, sprang upon the works, cheering their men on, when a shot struck the officer whose face was turned down from me, killing him instantly. Jackson, a boy from my own company and regiment, not over 17 years of age, mounting the works at the same time and seeing the shot fired, turned his gun, it being unloaded, bayonet down, and threw it spear fashion with 'Take that, you rebel son of a bitch,' striking the man who had fired the shot just above the heart. The force with which he threw it drove the bayonet entirely through his chest, burying at least 4 inches of the muzzle of the gun in the breast of the Confederate, who uttered the most unearthly yell I have ever heard from human lips, as he fell over backward with the gun sticking in him. About 1 o'clock it rained heavily, and wounded men dragged themselves about, drinking out of the pools and hollows. Those who were so disabled as to be helpless lay with open mouths to cool their parched tongues by catching the few drops as they fell. Back of the salient was a sinkhole. Into this rain and blood collected until it was full of red water, and around this were 100 wounded men drinking and groaning. A schoolmate and intimate friend of Major Church, both belonging to the 26th Michigan, fell on top of the works that morning. He was the only son of a wealthy and indulgent parents. When volunteers were called for in the hour of the nation's need, he was among the first to step forward and put his name down, saying he was going as a private and try to make a man of himself. We found the remains where they fell. There had been no time to remove them, and they had lain on top of the works during the entire engagement. And had it not been for some of the comrades who had seen him fall and identified the place, we would have never recognized it as having been a soldier. There was no semblance of humanity about the mass that was lying before us. The only thing I could liken it to was a sponge. I presumed 5,000 bullets had passed through it." End quote. So as you can see from that very detailed account of the battle at the Muleshoe, it was horrific fighting in which the 2nd Delaware again was engaged. Private George Wan, on the right, was in Company K of the 2nd Delaware, was present at the Muleshoe. He would go on to survive the war and muster out of service in October of 1861. This photograph was most likely taken in the winter of 63 to 64, when the 2nd Delaware was also allowing soldiers to go home on leave. On the left is Lieutenant Colonel David L. Stricker and Captain John Evans. Evans would be killed on May 10, 1864, during skirmishing along the lines at Spotsylvania by minie or musket ball through the body, according to the regimental surgeon's report. Evans died, quote, a few hours after receiving it and just after reaching the division hospital, end quote. Stricker also would be killed on May 12, 1864 at the Battle of Spotsylvania, quote, killed instantly by a piece of shell striking him in the side, end quote. Brevet Major General John R. Brooke in the after-battle report wrote, quote, Lieutenant Colonel Stricker, 2nd Delaware, in command of the 53rd Pennsylvania, to which regiment I had assigned him on the night of the 9th, deserves great credit for the gallant and soldierly manner in which he fought his regiment. To Colonel Beaver, Lieutenant Colonel Stricker, and Lieutenant Colonel Hamill, I am desirous of calling attention of the General Commanding. In General Hancock's official report, he writes, quote, I feel that I cannot speak too highly of the soldierly conduct and discipline displayed by Brooks and Brown's brigade on this occasion. Attacked by an entire division of the enemy, Heath's, they reportedly beat him back, holding their ground with unyielding courage until they were ordered to withdraw, when they retired with such order and steadiness as to merit the highest price. Colonel James A. Beaver of the 148th Pennsylvania and Lieutenant Colonel David L. Stricker of the 2nd Delaware are particularly mentioned, Colonel Brooke, for marked services and conspicuous courage. Colonel Coons, 14th Indiana, Lieutenant Colonel Stricker of the 2nd Delaware, and Lieutenant Colonel Merriam of the 16th Massachusetts, 3 brave and able officers were killed while leading their men into action during the storming of an enemy's works at Spotsylvania on the morning of the 12th of May, end quote. So the 2nd Delaware's losses were 2 officers and 4 enlisted men killed, 1 officer and 23 enlisted men wounded, 11 men captured or missing, equaling a total of 41 casualties. After the Battle of Spotsylvania, Colonel William P. Bailey would resign on May 16, 1864, horrified at the significant loss of the regiment at the Battle of Spotsylvania. Upon his request, Division Commander Major General Francis Barlow endorsed the resignation with the underlined notation, "This officer is a coward." Essentially wiped out, the 2nd Delaware was forced to attach to the 1st Delaware Regiment Volunteer Infantry until July of 1864, when most of the enlistments would run out. Company K remained in service until October, when it was mustered out of service as well. Following the Battle of Spotsylvania, the Union and Confederate forces would entrench around the city of Petersburg. Beginning in June of 1864, lasting until April of 1865, forces would continually battle each other, the 2nd Delaware obviously serving until the end of October. Many of the men who were in the 2nd Delaware would end up re-enlisting into the 1st Delaware and various other regiments. Major Peter McCullough would be promoted to lieutenant colonel and continue to fight until his wounding during the siege of Petersburg in June of 1864. He was found wounded on the field and would eventually recover from his wounds. Many of the men who were in the 2nd, as I said, would join up in what would eventually become the 1st Delaware Veteran Volunteer Regiment, which would serve for the remainder of the war. After the breakthrough at Petersburg, the Army of the Confederates would surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Appomattox County, Virginia. Though the war would still continue, the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia virtually put a nail in the coffin for the Confederacy. Those who re-enlisted in the summer of 1864 would go on to march in the Grand March in May of 1865 in Washington, D.C., promoting the Army of the Potomac after its victory over the Army of Northern Virginia. Those who had re-enlisted, as well as others in the Army, would officially be mustered out of service in July of 1865. After the war, you would see a lot of veteran groups. The most notable one was the Grand Army of the Republic, who would support veteran affairs. They would promote parades, fundraising for different veterans in different regiments. They would put monuments out on battlefields. They did a lot of great work. Within Delaware, there was going to be 29 posts. This man, Samuel Johnson, is depicted in a parade in Wilmington, Delaware. And at the time this photograph was taken, he was 91 years old. This photograph is of Grand Army of the Republic veteran Private Walter Robert Sloan of Company B, 2nd Delaware. Many of the veterans would return for reunions to see old comrades in which they had fought with. In 1913, there was a reunion at the Battle of Gettysburg, as well as for the 25th, the 50th, and 75th anniversaries of the battle. In this photograph, you can see Union and Confederate veterans shaking hands along the stone wall at Gettysburg. Monuments would be erected at many battlefields, particularly including Antietam and Gettysburg. This is the monument that is erected to the 1st Delaware Volunteer Infantry at Antietam. The 2nd Delaware's monument at Antietam is located at the end of the sunken lane by the observation tower. It's a great monument to go and check out. This photograph is of the Gettysburg Monument to all Delaware soldiers and regiments who fought in the battle. This monument was actually the last to be accepted to the battlefield in 2000. The National Park does not generally accept monuments, especially after the last of the veterans have died, so it was particularly special that Delaware was able to erect this monument. Ken Burns, of notable fame for his Civil War miniseries, was the keynote speaker, as well as reenactors who portrayed the 2nd Delaware were in attendance. The border is of oak and pine boughs, which symbolize the distinct cultures of northern and southern Delaware. And the back of the plaque lists 692 Delaware soldiers who fought with the 1st and 2nd Delaware at the battle, and talks of the regiment's battle history, and concludes with, "This monument is dedicated to the memory of all Delawareans who fought at Gettysburg, both Union and Confederate." So again, Delaware is a border state. It's unknown the exact numbers of Delaware citizens who went and fought in Confederate regiments. However, it did happen. This photograph is of the 2nd Delaware reenacting unit, which is in Delaware. They portray the 2nd Delaware and go to various living histories and reenactments throughout the state of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, going as far south as North Carolina. This picture was taken at the Laurel Veterans Day Parade. In today's climate, it's important to remember the memory of not only the Delaware men, but all men who fought in the war. Such establishments as the Delaware Public Archives, who have historic records pertaining to the 2nd Delaware, the Delaware Historical Society, Historical and Cultural Affairs, all work to preserve the memory of what these men were fighting for. I'd like to send a special thanks out to Laura Walsh of Historical and Cultural Affairs, who provided me with these wonderful photographs of items pertaining to Delaware soldiers that are housed at the Historical and Cultural Affairs building in Dover. So on the right is a stencil of 1st Sergeant Thomas H. Ashes to stencil in on the various equipment that he might have had. On the left is the personal trunk of Lieutenant Colonel William P. Bailey, who was commanding of the 2nd Delaware. Laura also was kind enough to send over photographs of ID tags from 2 Delaware soldiers, including that of Colonel William P. Bailey and Corporal J.P. Barney of Company D, 2nd Delaware. Again, it is so important to remember what these men fought for, what they died for, why they gave their life, whether it be for the Union, whether it be to free all men. It's so important to never forget why these men fought and to preserve their memory. I thank you so much for tuning in to this series, and I hope that you all gained a considerable amount of knowledge from these presentations. Thank you very much.